32 years ago, a group of 8 young violinists and their beloved professor vanished without a trace on their way to a highly anticipated recital. No bodies, no evidence, just silence. Their families searched desperately, but as time passed, the world moved on, leaving the tragedy buried beneath layers of grief and unanswered questions. But now, after more than 3 decades, a father stumbles upon a violin, one that should not exist. Inside it, a hidden message leads him down a path no one was meant to walk, forcing him to confront a terrifying possibility. What if they were never truly gone? What if the music was never meant to be forgotten? And what if something has been waiting all this time? The truth will break hearts. The past will rewrite itself. And by the time it all ends, one question will remain. Are some mysteries better left unsolved? If you're ready for a story that will haunt your thoughts and stir your soul, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let's begin. Thomas Miller never expected the past to find its way back to him. For 3 decades, he had lived with the unbearable weight of uncertainty, waking up each day with the same unanswered question. Where is my son? David had been just 8 years old, a child with dreams too big for his small hands to hold, a boy who found solace in the notes of his violin. He was supposed to have been safe, traveling with his friends and their trusted professor to a recital that should have marked the beginning of their musical journeys. But instead, they had all disappeared into nothingness. The case had baffled the nation, a mystery that refused to be solved. Investigators combed every inch of the roads, the forests, the abandoned buildings. Psychics claimed to hear their echoes in the wind. Conspiracy theorists spun elaborate tales of secret kidnappings, hidden experiments, and cult rituals. And yet, the truth remained locked away, out of reach. Until now, the package arrived on a cold, quiet morning, left on his doorstep with no return address. Thomas almost didn't notice it at first, barely glancing at the small, unassuming box as he stepped out to retrieve his newspaper. It wasn't until he reached down that he felt it. The weight of something familiar, something that sent a shiver down his spine before he even opened it. His hands trembled as he tore away the cardboard, his breath catching when he saw what was inside. A violin, but not just any violin. It was worn, aged by time, its wood slightly warped from water damage. The strings had snapped, curling like withered vines against the bridge. And yet, even in its ruined state, he knew. It was Michael's. Michael had been David's best friend, inseparable since the day they met. They had played together, learned together, shared secrets and whispers between rehearsals. And now, 32 years later, his violin had found its way back. But there was no sign of Michael, no sign of David, no sign of the others. Just this silent, broken instrument, carrying a message that made Thomas's heart pound in his chest. Find the piano. It holds the truth. The words were carved into the back of the violin, etched with a precision that sent a chill down his spine. Thomas traced them with his fingers, his mind racing. The piano. He hadn't thought about the conservatory in years, had forced himself to forget the endless nights spent standing outside its doors, begging for answers that never came. But now the past was calling him back. The phone rang, startling him so badly that he nearly dropped the violin. He reached for it with shaky hands, barely managing to press it against his ear before speaking. Hello. Silence. And then, a voice. A whisper, light as a breath, fragile as a memory. Help us. The line went dead. Thomas stood frozen, his pulse roaring in his ears. He looked down at the violin, then toward the distant horizon where the old conservatory still stood, abandoned and forgotten. He had spent 32 years searching for answers, and now it seemed the answers had finally come looking for him. The conservatory was a ghost of what it once had been. Eleanor Wright stood outside the rusted gates, staring at the building with a mixture of dread and determination. She had not set foot here since she was a child, since the day her teacher and classmates vanished without a trace. She had been one of them, one of the students meant to be on that bus. But fate, or luck, or something greater, had kept her away that day. A fever had stolen her chance to perform, grounding her in bed while her friends boarded the bus without her. It had taken her years to stop feeling guilty, but she had never stopped searching. And now, she had a reason to believe the search was not over. She ran her fingers over the violin she had received just days ago, almost identical to the one Thomas had found. The same water damage, the same broken strings, and the same message etched into the wood with unwavering precision. Find the piano. It holds the truth. She had tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was a cruel hoax, a coincidence, a trick played by an unseen hand. But deep down, she had known. Something was calling them back, and she wasn't the only one who had received the message. Eleanor. She turned to see Thomas approaching, his face lined with years of pain and exhaustion. He looked at her as if seeing a ghost, as if the sight of her standing there meant that all the grief, all the torment, all the sleepless nights had not been in vain. "You got one too," she said, nodding toward the violin case in his hands. He exhaled, the weight of 32 years pressing down on his shoulders. "Yeah." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling through the overgrown weeds that had taken root in the cracks of the pavement. The conservatory loomed before them, its windows dark and lifeless. But something in the air felt charged, as if the building itself was waiting, holding its breath for their arrival. Without another word, they stepped forward together. The doors groaned in protest as they pushed them open, revealing a world frozen in time. Dust coated every surface, the scent of old wood and forgotten music thick in the air. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor, forgotten sheet music crumbling at their feet. And at the far end of the room, covered in a thin veil of dust and neglect, stood the piano. Thomas hesitated. This was it. The moment he had waited for, dreaded, longed for, and feared. He could feel his heart pounding as he stepped closer, his fingers hovering over the keys. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor whispered. He frowned. "Hear what?" She swallowed hard. "The violins." And then he heard it too, soft at first like the wind through the trees. A distant, eerie melody, floating through the empty halls. The sound of bows gliding over strings, of notes hanging in the air like ghosts of a song never finished. It was impossible, and yet it was real. Thomas reached for the piano lid, lifting it slowly, half expecting to find nothing. But what he saw made his breath hitch in his throat. Inside the piano, beneath the strings, lay a folded piece of paper, a single handwritten note. They never left. A shiver ran down his spine. For 32 years, they had believed the children were gone. But what if they had been here all along? The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Thomas stared at the note in his trembling hands, the words carved into the page with careful, deliberate strokes. They never left. The weight of those 3 words pressed against his chest like an unbearable truth he wasn't ready to face. Eleanor stood beside him, her breath unsteady, her gaze fixed on the piano as if expecting something, someone, to emerge from within its depths. She had spent years trying to convince herself that what happened that night had been unsolvable, that there was no rational explanation for how an entire group of children and their professor had simply disappeared. But now, standing here, in this abandoned conservatory where time itself seemed to have stopped, she felt the past reaching out to her, whispering, waiting. "This doesn't make sense," Thomas murmured, his voice hoarse. "If they never left, then where are they?" Eleanor took the note from his hands, studying the faded ink. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It was careful, practiced, with the same elegant script she had seen so many times before. "This is Mr. Whitmore's handwriting." Thomas's stomach twisted. Jonathan Whitmore, the man who had been a father figure to so many, a respected teacher, an inspiration, a man who had vanished alongside his students without a single trace. And yet, his words sat here waiting to be found. A slow chill crept up Eleanor's spine. What if? She hesitated, afraid of the thought forming in her mind. What if they're still here, somewhere, somehow? Thomas ran a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in like a heavy fog. That's impossible. But was it? Eleanor's fingers hovered over the piano keys, her heart hammering in her chest. She remembered the way Mr. Whitmore used to play, the way he told them that music wasn't just sound. It was memory, it was emotion, it was alive. "We should try," she said, almost to herself. Thomas frowned. "Try what?" She pressed a single key. A low, resonant note echoed through the empty conservatory, bouncing off the walls like a ghost of the past. And then, before the sound fully faded, another note followed. But Eleanor hadn't touched the piano again. Thomas stiffened. "Did you hear that?" A shiver ran down her spine. She played another note. And once again, something, a presence unseen, unheard, responded. It was an answer. They worked in silence, each of them lost in thought as they carefully lifted the old, yellowed sheets of music from the piano's hidden compartment. The notes were handwritten, unfamiliar, but there was something unsettling about them. "These aren't just notes," Eleanor whispered. "They're names." Thomas looked closer, his heart pounding as he traced the ink. It wasn't just music. It was a message, a code. The names of the missing children were woven into the melody, hidden between the staves, blended into the very fabric of the composition. David, Michael, Clara, Ethan, every single child. And at the very bottom of the page, scrawled hastily as though the writer had been running out of time, were the words, "Play it and you will see." Eleanor's hands shook. "We have to do this." Thomas hesitated, his gut warning him against it. But the years of pain, of not knowing, of waiting for answers that never came, pushed him forward. Slowly, his fingers found the keys and he began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, carrying a weight that neither of them could explain. As the melody built, something shifted in the air. The room felt different, heavier, warmer, as if time itself was bending around them. And then the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like a breeze brushing through the cracks in the walls. Then it grew stronger, weaving itself into the music. Voices, familiar voices, children's voices. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" The whispers weren't coming from the outside. They were coming from the piano. Thomas's fingers faltered, but the melody continued. The piano was playing by itself. And the voices, they were calling their names. "Dad!" Thomas's entire body went cold. The voice was small, hesitant, full of fear and longing. A voice he hadn't heard in 32 years. A voice that belonged to a little boy with bright eyes and tiny hands that once held a violin as if it were his entire world. "David!" The whispers stopped. The music ended. The silence was deafening. And then, the piano lid slammed shut. Eleanor stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Thomas stood frozen, his hands still hovering over the keys, his face drained of color. What was that?" she stammered. Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The voice, the melody, the impossible. "They're trapped," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somehow, they never left because they couldn't." The thought was too much, too terrifying to comprehend. Thomas turned toward her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. "Then we have to find a way to bring them back." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. But how? They had no answers, only more questions. But they knew one thing, this was just the beginning. That night, Thomas sat alone in his darkened living room, the violin resting in his lap like a relic from another life. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, refusing to let him rest. And then his phone rang. He hesitated before answering, half expecting the silence from before. But this time there was no whisper, no ghostly plea, just a single raspy breath. And then, "You shouldn't have played the music." The line went dead. Thomas's hands clenched around the violin. The mystery was far from over. And now someone was watching. The voice on the phone haunted Thomas long into the night. He replayed it over and over in his mind, dissecting each syllable, each breath. You shouldn't have played the music. Who had called him? How had they known what he and Eleanor had done? And more importantly, why were they afraid of the music? He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with the sound of violins, of whispers echoing through the dark, of the weight of David's voice calling to him from the unknown. When he finally awoke, drenched in sweat and tangled in his sheets, he knew there was no turning back. By the time he arrived at the conservatory the next morning, Eleanor was already there, pacing near the piano with dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "You heard it too," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. "Someone called me last night. They knew about the music." Eleanor's breath caught. "Who?" "I don't know. But they didn't sound like they were warning me for my safety. It was more like," he hesitated, trying to find the words, "like they were afraid of what happens if we keep going." Eleanor swallowed hard, glancing down at the piano. "Then we have to keep going." Thomas exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to tell her that maybe they were going too far, that maybe some things weren't meant to be uncovered. But he couldn't, because the moment he had heard David's voice, every doubt, every hesitation had disappeared. He was willing to risk everything to bring his son back. Eleanor pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket and handed it to him. "I went through all of Mr. Whitmore's old compositions last night. This was the only one that doesn't match the others." Thomas unfolded the page, his eyes scanning the handwritten notes. It was another piece of music, unfinished, its final measures left blank. "The Return," he read aloud. Eleanor nodded. "I think this is what Mr. Whitmore was trying to complete. Maybe this is what he was trying to use to bring them back." Thomas ran a hand over the worn paper, his pulse quickening. "Then we need to finish it." Eleanor hesitated. "But what if? What if it works?" Thomas cut in, his voice firm. "What if this is what we've been looking for?" Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. "We don't even know where to start. Mr. Whitmore must have had a reason for stopping where he did." Thomas's gaze darkened. "Then we find out what that reason was." Their search took them deep into the forgotten corners of the conservatory. Dust-covered records, old performance programs, music sheets long abandoned. They pored over every detail, searching for anything that could give them insight into Mr. Whitmore's work. Hours passed. The sun shifted in the sky, casting long shadows through the cracked windows. Eleanor was beginning to think they'd found all they could when Thomas suddenly stilled. "Eleanor," he said, his voice strangely tight. She turned, finding him standing by an old cabinet, holding something in his hands. It was a notebook, its cover worn, its pages yellowed with age. He flipped it open, his breath hitching as he scanned the contents. "It's his," Thomas whispered. "Mr. Whitmore's journal." Eleanor rushed to his side, her eyes darting over the elegant script. The first few entries were mundane notes about lessons, performance schedules, his students' progress. But as they flipped further, the tone changed. March 7th, 1993. "The music is more than I ever imagined. There is something within it, something I cannot explain." April 2nd, 1993. "The children, they hear it too. They feel it. The music speaks to them in ways I never intended. I am both fascinated and terrified." April 25th, 1993. "I made a mistake." Eleanor's heart pounded. "What mistake?" she murmured, flipping through the pages faster. "And then they found it." May 18th, 1993. "I should never have played it. I thought it would be safe, that the music would only be an experiment, an exploration of sound beyond its limits. But I was wrong. The melody opened something I cannot control. The children, they are not gone. But they are not here either. And I fear that if I try to bring them back." The entry stopped abruptly. Thomas clenched his jaw. He knew. He knew what he had done. Eleanor's hands shook. The music didn't just make them disappear, put them somewhere else. They stared at each other, realization sinking in like a stone. The children had never truly left. They had been trapped. They left the conservatory in silence, their minds racing. "We need to find someone who knew him," Eleanor said finally. Someone who might have answers. Thomas thought for a long moment before nodding. Margaret Whitmore. Eleanor's eyes widened. His sister. She's the only family he had left. If anyone knows what really happened, it's her. It took them hours to track her down, and when they finally found her, she was nothing like they expected. She was older now, frail, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, but her eyes, sharp, watchful, told them she had not forgotten. She let them inside her modest home without a word, leading them to a small sitting room cluttered with books and photographs. She sat slowly, folding her hands in her lap, studying them with a quiet intensity. "You're looking for Jonathan," she said finally. "Aren't you?" Thomas swallowed. "Yes, he hesitated. "We found his journal." Margaret exhaled, closing her eyes briefly. "Then you already know." Eleanor leaned forward. "We don't know everything. We don't know where the children are." Margaret's expression was unreadable. "You do," she said softly. "You just don't understand it yet." Thomas's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Margaret gazed at him for a long moment before speaking again. "Tell me, have you heard the music?" The silence that followed was answer enough. She nodded as if she had expected it. "Then you are already part of it." Thomas clenched his fists. "Please," he said, his voice almost breaking. "My son is in there. I need to bring him back." Margaret studied him, then slowly reached for something on the table beside her. A box, small, ornate. She slid it toward him. Inside was a single sheet of music, old and fragile. Thomas's heart pounded as he read the title. "The Return, the Missing Piece." "The last note must never be played," Margaret whispered. Eleanor's hands clenched. "Why?" Margaret's eyes darkened. "Because it requires a sacrifice." Thomas's blood ran cold. Margaret met his gaze, her expression sorrowful. "To bring them back, someone must take their place." The room fell into silence, heavy with the weight of what had been said. Thomas looked down at the music in his hands, his pulse pounding. He had spent 32 years waiting for this moment, hoping, praying. Now he had to make a choice, and he wasn't sure he could live with it. Thomas could feel the weight of the music sheet in his hands, as if it carried the burden of every lost moment, every unanswered question, every sleepless night spent staring at the emptiness where his son should have been. His fingers trembled as he traced the notes, his mind struggling to accept the reality before him. To bring them back, someone must take their place. The words echoed in his skull, relentless, unforgiving. Margaret sat in silence, watching him, her expression unreadable. Eleanor, sitting beside him, leaned forward, her voice hushed but firm. "There has to be another way." Margaret shook her head slowly, her silver hair catching the dim light. "If there was, don't you think Jonathan would have found it?" Her voice was soft but carried a quiet devastation. "He searched for years. He tried to undo what had been done. And in the end, he learned the truth. There is no return without sacrifice." Thomas's jaw clenched. Then why did he leave the music unfinished? Why not play it himself? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze heavy with something unreadable. Because he was afraid of what the sacrifice would mean. Eleanor exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "This doesn't make sense. If Jonathan knew all this, if he understood what had happened, then why didn't he warn the families? Why let them believe their children were simply gone?" Margaret looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. "Because they wouldn't have believed him." Thomas shook his head, frustration building inside him like a storm. "Then tell us what really happened." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then finally she spoke. "Jonathan never intended for this to happen," she murmured. "The music was supposed to be an experiment. He had always been fascinated by the connection between sound and memory, between music and time itself. He believed that a melody, played with the right intent, the right energy, could reach beyond what we perceive as reality. He thought he could create something that transcended time." She swallowed. "But he never realized that music could be a door." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. A door to what? Margaret's gaze darkened. Somewhere else. Thomas's stomach twisted. You're saying the children are in another place? Margaret hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Not dead, not gone, but not here either. Trapped in the music, in the space between the notes, in the echoes of a melody that was never meant to be played. Eleanor's breath hitched. Then why would a sacrifice be needed to bring them back? Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Because the door doesn't open both ways. If they return, someone else must go. That is the balance. A suffocating silence filled the room. Thomas's mind raced. It was impossible, unthinkable, and yet deep down he knew. He had heard David's voice. He had felt the music wrap around him like a whisper from another world. As much as he wanted to deny it, to tell himself this was madness, he knew. The children were waiting. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Who went last time? Margaret exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, there was something haunted in her gaze. Jonathan never told me. She looked down. But I think it was him. Thomas froze. Eleanor's eyes widened. Margaret continued, her voice hollow. No one ever found his body, did they? A chill ran down Thomas's spine. No, they never had. Jonathan Whitmore had vanished alongside his students. But what if he hadn't disappeared the way everyone thought? What if he had played the final note and taken their place? Thomas swallowed hard, gripping the sheet music so tightly that the paper crumpled beneath his fingers. If Jonathan had already sacrificed himself once, what did that mean for them? Eleanor sat back, shaking her head in disbelief. This is insane. We're talking about giving up a life to undo something that happened 32 years ago. How do we even know it will work? Margaret met her gaze with quiet certainty. Because the music is calling you. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Neither of them could deny it. They had heard it, felt it, and the music wasn't finished yet. That night, Thomas sat alone in his living room, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest like an iron hand. His son was out there, somewhere in the echoes of a melody that had never been completed. And now he knew how to bring him back. But at what cost? He stared down at the violin resting on the table before him. It was David's. He had kept it all these years, untouched, a relic of a life that had been stolen too soon. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached for it, running his fingers along the worn wood. Memories flooded him. David, barely 6 years old, gripping the tiny violin with excitement in his eyes. Dad, listen to this. David, practicing late into the night, determined to perfect every note. Do you think Mr. Whitmore will like it? David, on the morning of the recital, his face glowing with anticipation. I can't wait to play for you. And then nothing. A 32-year silence. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, emotion clawing at his throat. He had waited so long, searched for so long, and now he was being given a choice. Terrible choice. His phone buzzed. The sound jolted him back to reality, his pulse spiking as he glanced at the screen. No number, just a blank, empty ID. His fingers hovered over the answer button before he finally pressed it. Silence. And then, Dad. Thomas's heart stopped. It was him, David. His voice was small, fragile, distant. Dad, please. A breath hitched on the other end of the line. We're waiting. The call cut out. Thomas sat frozen, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had his answer. David was still out there, and he needed him. Thomas closed his eyes, his decision solidifying like stone. He would finish the music, no matter the cost. The next morning, Eleanor met him at the conservatory. She took one look at his face and knew. You're going to play it, aren't you? She whispered. Thomas nodded, his jaw set. I have to. Eleanor swallowed, glancing at the piano where the unfinished music still rested. And if it works? Thomas exhaled. Then David comes home. Eleanor hesitated. And if it doesn't? Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't, because he couldn't think about that possibility. Together, they stepped into the room, the air thick with something unspoken. The piano stood waiting, silent and expectant. The music lay before them, unfinished. Thomas took his seat, his fingers hovering over the keys. And then he began to play. The first notes filled the air, rich and full, vibrating with something unseen. The room shifted. The light dimmed. The walls seemed to stretch, as if reality itself was bending to the sound. And then, from the shadows, the violins answered. Eleanor gasped, stepping back as the sound grew, swelling around them, filling every corner of the space. It was a song unfinished for decades, a melody frozen in time, and now it was coming back to life. Thomas pressed forward, playing with everything he had, his heart pounding with every note. And then, the final measure, the last note. His fingers hovered over the keys. The moment of truth had arrived. He took a breath, and he played it. The world shattered. The instant Thomas pressed the final note, the world around him shifted. The air crackled, thick and charged like a storm about to break. The piano keys beneath his fingers vibrated, the wood groaning as if resisting the very sound it was producing. Eleanor gasped beside him, stepping back as an invisible force rippled through the room, distorting the air like heat rising from the pavement. The melody continued even after Thomas's hands had lifted. The notes rang out, impossibly sustained, swirling through the conservatory as if played by unseen hands. The sound was beautiful, haunting, otherworldly. But beneath it, beneath the layers of harmonies and echoes, there was something else. A whisper. No, many whispers. Thomas's breath caught. He knew those voices. Children. The sound of violins joined the melody, weaving through the air like a forgotten symphony, their bows gliding over strings with aching precision. It was them. David. His heart pounded as he turned, searching the dark corners of the room, his pulse roaring in his ears. He could feel them. They were close, so close. Thomas, Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with fear. Something's happening. He could barely process her words. His entire body was drawn forward, compelled by a force he couldn't explain. The conservatory around them was flickering, warping. It was as if the walls themselves were folding in and out of existence, revealing glimpses of another place, a place not meant to be seen. Shadows moved within those glimpses, figures, small, distant at first, but then they grew clearer, closer. Thomas's breath hitched. Children. They stood in the shifting haze, their faces pale, their expressions lost between recognition and something more distant, something unreadable. Their bodies flickered like candlelight, caught between worlds, between time itself, and in the center of them all, clutching his violin with wide, frightened eyes, David. Thomas choked on a breath. His son. His beautiful 8-year-old son, standing exactly as he had been that night, wearing the same neatly pressed recital outfit, his shoes polished, his violin clutched tightly in his tiny hands. David! Thomas surged forward, reaching for him. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto his father's. Dad! The moment his voice rang out, the entire room convulsed. A sharp, shuddering wave of energy pulsed outward, sending Eleanor stumbling backward, forcing Thomas to his knees. The children wavered, their forms flickering like dying flames. David's expression twisted with fear. Dad, help us! Thomas fought against the force holding him down, his arms straining to reach for his son. I'm here, David. I'm right here. David took a step forward, but something yanked him back. His small body jerked violently, and a look of pure terror flashed across his face. No, Thomas gasped, scrambling to his feet. Eleanor's voice rang out behind him. Something's pulling them back. Thomas's heart pounded. No, not after coming this far. Not after 32 years of waiting, searching, praying. And then the whispers changed. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. One must stay. The voices surrounded them, overlapping, suffocating. One must stay. Thomas's blood ran cold. This was it. The choice. The price. Eleanor turned to him, horror dawning in her eyes. Thomas! But he already knew. He already knew. His hands shook as he looked at his son, at the children trapped in this impossible limbo, at the weight of 3 decades pressing down on his shoulders. If he didn't do this, they would stay lost. They would be trapped forever, held in the grasp of an unfinished melody that had stolen them away. His voice was barely above a whisper. Take me. Eleanor's gasp sliced through the air. No. Thomas's gaze never wavered from his son. Let them go. The moment the words left his lips, the room breathed. A pulse of energy rolled outward, and suddenly, the children lurched forward as if an invisible thread had snapped. Their forms solidified, color flooding back into their faces. The world around them groaned, stretching, reshaping itself. David stumbled, his small hands gripping the violin as his feet touched solid ground. His eyes were wild, darting around in confusion. Thomas's chest ached. He was here. He was here. But something was wrong. His limbs felt heavy. The air around him felt thicker, as if it were hardening. He looked down at his hands, and his breath caught. His fingers were fading. Eleanor screamed. Thomas! A jolt of fear struck him, raw and deep, but beneath it, there was something else. Acceptance. This had been the price all along. Someone had to stay. And if it meant David could live, if it meant the children could go home, then he would give himself willingly. The edges of his vision blurred, darkness creeping in. Eleanor lunged for him, but her hands passed through him like smoke. No! She sobbed, her fingers clutching at empty air. There has to be another way. Thomas, please. David's small voice broke through the chaos. Dad. Thomas forced himself to smile, even as his body began to dissolve. You're safe now. Tears welled in David's eyes. No, don't leave me. Thomas's heart shattered, but it was too late. The final note faded into silence, and Thomas Miller was gone. The first thing David saw when he opened his eyes was the sky. A sky he hadn't seen in 32 years. He gasped, his small body trembling, his fingers still curled around his violin. Around him, the other children blinked in confusion, their faces pale and dazed. They were back. They were home. Eleanor stood among them, tears streaming down her face, her hands covering her mouth in shock and grief. But Thomas was gone. David spun frantically. Dad! Silence. His small chest heaved. Dad! Nothing. Eleanor knelt beside him, her own heart breaking as she pulled him into a tight embrace. He saved you, she whispered. David trembled in her arms. But where is he? She had no answer. The conservatory was quiet now. The music had ended, but something lingered, a single faint note. Eleanor turned, her breath catching as she saw it. The piano. The lid had closed. The keys were still. The music had ended. But one thing had changed. The violin Thomas had carried, the one that had arrived mysteriously on his doorstep, sat on the piano bench untouched, waiting, and carved into its wood, as if left by unseen hands, were 3 simple words. I am here. Eleanor's breath hitched. David's small fingers brushed over the words, his lips quivering. Dad! No answer. But in the quiet hush of the room, in the stillness of the space between sound and silence, the faintest whisper of a violin played, and they knew. Thomas had never truly left. The house was too quiet. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, her fingers gripping the ceramic so tightly she thought it might shatter. It had been 3 days since the children returned. 3 days since David opened his eyes beneath a sky he didn't recognize. 3 days since Thomas disappeared, since he had taken their place. Her mind replayed the last moments over and over, each memory sharper than the last. The way the air had warped around him, the way his fingers had begun to fade before he even realized what was happening. The look in his eyes when he had accepted his fate. Not with fear, but with love. He saved them, and now he was gone. Eleanor exhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. She had spent the past 3 days trying to help the children adjust, working with the authorities to reunite them with their families. It had been surreal, watching parents embrace children they had long accepted were lost, their sobs of disbelief filling the air. But nothing was stranger than David. He hadn't spoken much since returning. He clung to his violin, his fingers tracing the carved words over and over again. "I am here." Eleanor closed her eyes. The violin had been left behind, deliberately, she was sure of it. It was a message, connection. But to what? Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. She reached for it, expecting another call from the authorities. Instead, an unknown number flashed across the screen. Her heart clenched. She answered hesitantly. "Hello." Silence. And then, a sound. Faint, distant. A single violin note. Eleanor's breath hitched. The call ended. She stared at her phone, her pulse hammering. The logical part of her brain told her it was a coincidence, static, a cross signal. But the rest of her, her soul, told her otherwise. She needed to go back. The conservatory was exactly as they had left it. The air was still thick with something unspoken. The dust on the floor barely disturbed despite all that had transpired. The piano sat in the center of the room, its keys untouched, its presence almost solemn. And there, resting on the bench where Thomas had once sat, was the violin. Eleanor hesitated before stepping forward, the weight of grief pressing against her chest. She knelt beside the instrument, running her fingers along the wood. "Thomas," she whispered. Nothing. She reached for the bow, her hands trembling. The moment she touched it, the air shifted. And then, a single note. The violin vibrated beneath her fingertips, though no one was playing it. The sound was hollow, distant, like an echo from another time. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas." Silence. And then something more. A whisper, so faint she almost didn't hear it. "Eleanor." She choked back a sob, her fingers gripping the violin. He was here. He was still here. She had to find a way to reach him. David sat in his new bedroom, staring out the window. The world outside was bright, alive, nothing like the place he had been for so long. But it didn't feel real. His hands tightened around the violin. His father had been here, holding it, playing it, and now somehow he was inside it. A part of him refused to believe it. A part of him still expected to wake up in the in-between place, to hear the others calling to him, to feel the weight of endless time pressing against his chest. But this was real. His father was gone. Tears blurred his vision. He had spent years waiting for his father to find him. And now that he had saved him, he was gone. No. David's small fingers curled around the violin's neck. He refused to accept that. His father wouldn't leave him. Not truly. And then, without thinking, he lifted the violin and placed it beneath his chin. He played. The first note rang out, soft, hesitant. But then another followed. And another. The melody was familiar, one his father had played for him when he was young, before everything was taken away. It filled the room, wrapping around him like a memory. And then, something changed. The air thickened. The walls blurred. And suddenly, he wasn't in his room anymore. Eleanor gasped as a gust of wind swept through the conservatory, rattling the old windows. The violin in her hands vibrated violently, the bow slipping from her grasp. And then, a voice. Not a whisper, not a breath. A voice. "Mom!" Her stomach dropped. She turned slowly. David stood in the doorway, his violin still in his hands, his face pale. His lips trembled. "I saw him," he whispered. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. David took a shaky step forward. He was there, in the in-between place. She could barely find her voice. "David, I heard him," the boy insisted, his voice stronger now. "He's trying to come back." Eleanor's pulse pounded. David's small hands tightened around his violin. "But he can't do it alone." She stared at him, realization dawning like a slow-moving storm. He wasn't gone. He was trying to return, and they had to help him. The music wasn't finished yet. The room was silent as Eleanor sat beside David, their violins resting between them. "We have to play it," David said quietly. "Together." Eleanor hesitated. She had spent her whole life trying to run from this, from the echoes of the past, from the memories that haunted her. But she couldn't run anymore. Not if Thomas was still out there. She exhaled shakily. "All right." David nodded, lifting his violin. Eleanor followed. The first notes were slow, careful. A duet of past and present, of grief and hope. Their bows moved in unison, their breaths steady. And as the melody built, the air thickened once more. The walls flickered, the light shifted, and then a figure, faint at first, a shadow against the light, then clearer, and then a man. Thomas. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her violin. David's heart pounded. The music swelled, reaching its peak, stretching beyond sound, beyond time. And then, in the final crescendo, Thomas's eyes opened. He stepped forward. The world snapped back into place, and Thomas Miller collapsed onto the floor. Thomas hit the floor with a force that sent a gasp through Eleanor's lips. She barely had time to react before David was on his knees beside his father, his small hands gripping Thomas's arms, shaking him, desperate. "Dad? Dad, wake up!" His voice cracked, thick with emotion, the kind of heartbreak no child should ever have to bear. Eleanor's heart pounded as she dropped her violin and scrambled to Thomas's side, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid that if she did, he might disappear again. His body was solid, real, but unervingly cold, as if he had been pulled from a place where warmth didn't exist. His skin was pale, his breath shallow, his fingers curled slightly as though still grasping something unseen. David let out a small, choked sob. "He's not waking up." Eleanor forced herself to breathe, pressing her fingers against Thomas's wrist, pulse weak but steady. Relief flooded her, but it was quickly followed by fear. He was here, but something was wrong. He wasn't moving. She turned to David, whose wide, tear-filled eyes looked to her for answers. She had none, but they couldn't stay here. With effort, she lifted Thomas's limp body, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as she pulled him up. He was heavier than she expected, his weight pressing down on her, but she refused to let go. David rushed to help, gripping his father's other arm with all the strength his small body could muster. They needed to get him out. The conservatory walls seemed to groan as they moved. The air had shifted, changed, as though whatever door they had opened had not closed entirely. Eleanor ignored it. She had to focus, one step at a time. Get Thomas out. Get him home. They stumbled toward the entrance, and just as Eleanor reached for the door handle, Thomas inhaled sharply. She froze. David's grip on his father tightened. "Dad!" Thomas let out a breath, shallow, uneven, but his body tensed as if waking from a long, suffocating sleep. His fingers twitched. A low, broken sound escaped his lips. Then, his eyes opened. The world swayed around him. Thomas's first breath felt like drowning. He gasped, his chest heaving, his lungs burning as if he had been holding his breath for an eternity. His vision blurred, dark shapes swimming before his eyes. Voices, distant, distorted, called out to him. "Thomas, wake up!" He tried to focus, tried to make sense of the weight pressing down on him, the hands gripping his arms. And then, through the haze, a face. David, his son. Thomas blinked rapidly, his breath hitching. No, that wasn't possible. He had seen him from the other side, had reached for him, had let go of himself to save him. He had sacrificed himself. So how was he here? His body trembled, weak, unsteady. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, raw, like he had been screaming into nothingness for years. Eleanor's face came into focus next, her expression caught between relief and disbelief. "You're back," she whispered, as if saying it out loud might make it untrue. Thomas's lips parted, but no words came. His head spun, a sickening weight pressing against his skull. He had been gone. But now, "I don't understand," he rasped. his voice barely above a whisper. I was there." David clung to him, his small body trembling. "I played the music," he said, voice shaking. "We brought you back." The words settled into Thomas's mind slowly, heavily. He was back, but something felt wrong. He exhaled sharply, his chest tightening. The air around him felt different, the weight of his own body unfamiliar. He lifted his hands, staring at them as if they weren't his own. His fingers shook. They looked the same, felt the same, but something beneath his skin felt altered, like a melody just slightly out of tune. Eleanor must have noticed the way his expression shifted because her voice softened. "Thomas," he swallowed hard. "Something's not right." The room seemed to tilt, and suddenly the walls of the conservatory felt too close, the air too thin. He needed to leave. "Now, let's go," he muttered, pushing himself up despite the dizziness threatening to consume him. Eleanor and David helped steady him as they stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit his face, and for the first time he realized how different it felt. It wasn't the temperature. It was the weight of it, the way it pressed against his skin, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. They made their way to the car. Thomas barely registered the drive back. He was trapped inside his own mind, trying to piece together what had happened. He should have been gone. Why was he here? By the time they reached Eleanor's house, Thomas was exhausted. His limbs felt heavy, his body sluggish, his mind still caught in the space between two realities. David refused to leave his side, staying close, his small hands gripping his father's sleeve like he was afraid he might vanish again. Eleanor brought him water, forcing him to drink even as his hands trembled around the glass. He sat on her couch, his head in his hands, trying to steady himself. Minutes passed in silence. Then, a sound, faint, a whisper. Thomas's spine stiffened. He lifted his head slowly, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't the only one who heard it. David's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor stood abruptly, her body tense. "What was that?" Thomas didn't answer. He knew what it was. The sound came again. A whisper, barely there, hidden beneath the air itself. And then, the violin. A single, drawn-out note, distant but unmistakable. Eleanor's breath hitched. "The violin is at the conservatory." David clutched his father's arm, his voice small. "Dad, why is it still playing?" Thomas's hands curled into fists, because something had followed him back. The next few days were suffocating. Thomas could barely sleep, haunted by the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt colder, the air heavier. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, and the whispers, soft, distant, never truly went away. At first, he told himself it was paranoia, the aftereffects of what had happened. But then, things started to change. He would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping, his pulse racing, feeling something standing at the edge of his bed. But there was never anything there. David started waking up crying, unable to explain why. Eleanor called him one night, her voice tight. "Thomas, I swear I heard someone playing the piano." But when they checked, the keys were untouched. And then, the final sign. Thomas walked past a mirror one evening, just as the last bit of sunlight faded through the window. He barely glanced at it, until something made him stop. He turned back slowly, and his reflection didn't move. His breath caught, his heart pounded. For a full, terrifying moment, his reflection stared back at him, its eyes just slightly off, its lips curling in a way his own never did. And then, smiled. Thomas stumbled backward, his pulse hammering, his breath ragged. And in the quiet of the room, in the silence thick with something unseen, the violin played, a single, slow, haunting note. The melody was not finished, and something was still waiting. Thomas stumbled back from the mirror, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. His heart pounded so violently he could hear it in his ears, a dull roar drowning out every other sound. He blinked, his mind desperate to rationalize what he had just seen, to convince himself that his reflection could not have moved on its own. But it had. His chest tightened, His reflection had smiled at him. Not a trick of the light, not a shadow playing tricks on his tired mind. He had seen it, had felt the wrongness of it seep into his bones. And then the violin. The music still echoed faintly in the air. A single haunting note stretching out as if played from some unseen place just beyond the reach of reality. The same note he had heard in his dreams, in the silence between whispers. The melody was not finished. Something had followed him back. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. He forced himself to turn away from the mirror, to move, to breathe. His hands were shaking, his pulse erratic, his body caught between exhaustion and fear. This wasn't over. The music had saved him. But at what cost? Eleanor sat in her living room, gripping a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. She hadn't slept in days. The events of the past week had shattered any sense of normalcy she had left. Thomas was back. David was back. The children had returned. But it still felt wrong. Something lingered in the air. Something unseen, just out of reach, like a presence pressing against the walls, waiting. And then there was Thomas. She had watched him closely, searching for any sign that he was truly himself. He looked the same, sounded the same, but there were moments, small, fleeting, where he seemed off. Pauses too long between his words. Glances that lingered in places they shouldn't. A shadow of something unreadable in his eyes. And the violin. She hadn't gone back to the conservatory, hadn't touched the instrument since the night Thomas had returned. But she could hear it. Soft, distant, as if someone were playing it just beyond the walls of reality. She had tried to convince herself it was nothing. A trick of the mind. A lingering trauma. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't over. Her phone buzzed against the table, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw the name. Thomas. She hesitated before answering. Hello. A pause. A breath. Then, it's still with me. Eleanor froze. Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't think I came back alone. The night was heavy with silence. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, his hands pressed against his face, exhaustion weighing on him like an anchor. He hadn't told David what was happening. He didn't want to tell him. The boy had been through too much already. But he felt it. Something was wrong. The air in his house was thicker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. Shadows stretched too far, lingered too long. And the violin, it never truly stopped playing. He turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting toward the corner of the room. The violin case sat there, untouched, closed, but he could hear it. A single note, drawn out, vibrating through the walls. And then, a whisper. Thomas. His blood ran cold. The voice was his. Slowly, too afraid to move too quickly, he turned toward the mirror. His reflection stood there, still, unmoving, watching. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His own image stared back at him, eyes dark and unreadable. And then, it blinked. But he hadn't. He couldn't breathe. His entire body locked in place as the reflection smiled again. Slow, deliberate, unnatural. And then, it moved. Not a normal movement. Not a simple turn of the head or shift of the hands. It moved before he did. Like it wasn't copying him. Like it was acting on its own. Thomas stumbled backward, his pulse roaring in his ears. His body screamed at him to look away, to run, to leave the house and never return. But he couldn't move. The reflection took a step forward. Thomas's own body remained frozen. The glass rippled. The sound of the violin grew louder. And then his reflection spoke. You don't belong here. A breath hitched in his throat. His own voice, distorted, wrong, layered with something else. Something deeper. The reflection tilted its head. You should have stayed. A shudder ran through Thomas's body. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the reflection reached out and pressed a hand against the other side of the glass. The moment it made contact, a sharp, agonizing pull yanked through Thomas's chest. He gasped, stumbling forward as his body felt like it was being ripped apart, like something unseen was trying to drag him back to where he had come from. The mirror pulsed, and then, The lights flickered, the violin screamed, and Thomas collapsed to the floor. Eleanor banged on the door, her pulse hammering in her throat. She had driven straight to Thomas's house the moment he called, her heart racing with a fear she couldn't explain. Something was wrong. She pounded harder. "Thomas, open the door." Silence. A deep, gnawing dread curled in her stomach. She reached for the handle, turned easily. The door was unlocked. That wasn't right. She stepped inside cautiously, her breath slow, measured. The house was dark, silent, but there was something in the air, something thick and suffocating, pressing against her lungs. And then, the violin, a single, drawn-out note, playing from somewhere unseen. "Thomas?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. She stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel it, the presence of something unseen, watching, waiting. She moved through the house, her hands shaking, her breath shallow. And then she saw him. Thomas lay on the floor, motionless, his body curled in on itself. "Thomas!" She dropped beside him, pressing her hands to his shoulders. His skin was ice cold, his breathing shallow, but he was alive, barely. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, his breath shaky. And then, he smiled, but it wasn't his smile. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Something was very, very wrong. And in the silence, in the heavy stillness of the room, the mirror shifted. The reflection was still there, watching, waiting, and it was smiling. The violin played on. The melody was not finished, and neither was the nightmare. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to move, to run, to pull away from Thomas's body on the floor. But she couldn't. She was frozen in place, her fingers still gripping his ice-cold arms, her pulse thundering so loudly she could barely hear anything else, except for the violin. The melody stretched through the room like a lingering ghost, low and slow, a single note trembling in the heavy silence. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It was just there, woven into the very air, slipping between the walls, settling into the spaces where shadows stretched too long. Thomas's lips parted, his breath hitched, and then he opened his eyes. Eleanor recoiled. They weren't his eyes. They were too dark, too deep, as if something beneath them was shifting, watching, waiting. His pupils were too wide, swallowing all color, the whites barely visible. And the worst part, he was smiling, not in relief, not in recognition, not even in confusion. It was a smile that didn't belong to him. Eleanor's hands trembled as she tried to pull back, but Thomas's fingers tightened around her wrists, locking her in place. "Thomas!" Her voice barely came out. He blinked. The movement was slow, deliberate, and then his lips moved, but his voice didn't come out. Instead, "Eleanor." The whisper came from behind her. Her stomach twisted into a knot so tight she thought she might be sick. The voice was his, exactly his, but his mouth hadn't moved. His lips had stayed shut. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she slowly turned her head. The mirror, her heart stopped. His reflection was still there, but it wasn't copying him anymore. It was watching. It smiled wider, and then it lifted a hand. Eleanor's body locked as the reflection pressed its palm against the glass. The moment it made contact, a violent tremor rippled through the air, bending reality at the edges, warping the light. The house groaned, as if it was struggling to contain something vast and wrong. A crack splintered through the mirror. The violin's melody screeched, and Eleanor finally found her voice. "Thomas! Let go!" She yanked her hands free and scrambled back, her breath ragged, her pulse roaring in her ears. Thomas's body lurched forward as if pulled by invisible strings, his fingers twitching, his limbs stiff. He looked at her, through her, with an expression that sent ice down her spine, like he didn't recognize her, like he wasn't really there. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing. This wasn't Thomas, or at least not just Thomas. She staggered to her feet. David! The boy! She had to find David. He couldn't see this. He couldn't know. She turned toward the doorway, but before she could move, a whisper brushed against her ear. "Why did you bring him back?" Eleanor ran. David sat on his bed, knees drawn to his chest, the violin resting beside him. He hadn't touched it since that night, since the moment the music had brought his father home, or whoever had come back. Something felt wrong. He could feel it in the air, in the way his skin prickled whenever his father entered the room, in the way his voice seemed off, just slightly out of tune. His dad looked the same, sounded the same, but sometimes when he wasn't looking, David felt the wrongness, like when his dad would stand in the hallway for too long without moving, or when he caught him staring at the mirror without blinking, or the worst, when David woke up in the middle of the night and saw his dad standing at the foot of his bed, just standing, not saying anything, not breathing. David's small hands clenched into fists. That wasn't his dad. He knew it, and he needed to find out why. His fingers hesitated before curling around the violin's neck. The moment he touched it, a shiver ran down his spine. The wood felt warm, like something alive. Slowly, carefully, he lifted it beneath his chin, and he played. The first note rang out softly, filling the room with something more than sound. A whisper of movement, a shift in the air. David's breath hitched, and then a second violin joined in, but he wasn't playing it. His blood turned to ice. The second violin played just slightly out of sync, like an echo from a place that shouldn't exist. The sound filled the space, stretching beyond the walls, curling into the corners of the room. And then, David, his father's voice, but not from the hallway, not from inside the house, from the violin. David dropped it, scrambling back against the headboard, his breath coming in sharp, terrified gasps. The moment the instrument hit the floor, the music stopped. Silence, thick, smothering, and then a knock, not on the door, not on the walls, but on the mirror. David's head snapped toward it, his heart pounding. And in the reflection, his father stood there, but he wasn't in the room. He was inside the mirror. David's mouth went dry. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His father, the real one, pressed his hands against the glass, his face pale, his eyes desperate. "David, don't trust him." The boy's entire body locked. "That's not me." The whisper came from behind him. David barely had time to turn before something grabbed him. Eleanor burst into the room just as David let out a strangled gasp, his small body lurching forward. His arms flailed as if something unseen had yanked him toward the mirror, his feet barely scraping the floor. "David!" She rushed toward him, grabbing his shoulders, pulling him back with all her strength. He wasn't alone. Something was pulling him. And then, the glass cracked. A shattering pulse of energy surged through the room. Eleanor and David flew backward, slamming against the opposite wall. The mirror exploded outward, shards spiraling through the air like shattered time. And standing in the center of it all was Thomas. But not the one Eleanor had just left downstairs. Not the one that had smiled wrong. This Thomas was different. Pale, weak, but him. The moment his feet hit the floor, his breath came in ragged, gasping sobs, his hands clutching at his chest like he had just been pulled from the depths of something vast and wrong. Eleanor's mind reeled. Two Thomases. She turned. The other Thomas was standing in the doorway, smiling. And then, he moved. The world shattered. The violin screamed. And everything went dark. The world was unraveling. Eleanor hit the floor hard, her breath knocking out of her lungs as the impact rattled through her bones. The room had erupted into chaos. The air thick with static, the sound of the violin screeching through every inch of space like something alive, something angry. Glass from the shattered mirror littered the floor, reflecting fractured pieces of the nightmare around them. Two Thomases, one standing in the doorway watching with that wrong smile, the other, the real one, gasping for breath in front of the broken mirror, his body trembling as if he had just been pulled from something unimaginable. David clung to Eleanor's arm, his small fingers digging into her sleeve, his body shaking so violently she thought he might collapse. He was staring, wide-eyed, at the two versions of his father. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small, afraid. "That's not him." Eleanor forced herself to move, pulling David behind her, shielding him from whatever thing was standing in the doorway. Her mind was racing, but nothing made sense. How could this be happening? And then the other Thomas tilted his head. His smile stretched wider. "You should have stayed," he said softly. His voice was wrong, distorted, like it had been layered with something else. Thomas, the real Thomas, pushed himself up, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes desperate, pleading. "You have to listen to me," he rasped. "That's not me. That's..." The other Thomas moved, faster than he should have. One moment he was in the doorway, the next he was inches away. Eleanor barely had time to react before he reached for her. She threw herself backward, dragging David with her, her heart pounding as she felt the air shift where his fingers had just been. He had moved too fast. Not human. Not right. "Thomas?" Eleanor gasped, looking to the real one, her voice sharp with urgency. "What's happening?" Thomas struggled to stand, his body still weakened, but his eyes burned with understanding. "It followed me," he whispered. "I didn't come back alone." The words sent ice through Eleanor's veins. David whimpered. "Dad, what does that mean?" The other Thomas turned his head slowly toward the boy, his smile twitching, his eyes too dark. "It means," he said gently, "that I belong here now." David screamed. Thomas lunged. The two versions of him collided. The air cracked with an unseen force, sending a pulse through the room that rattled the walls. The violin shrieked. Eleanor grabbed David and pulled him back as the two Thomases struggled, their bodies blurring together like unstable reflections. The thing wearing Thomas's face didn't fight the way a person should. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, as if it wasn't bound by the same physics as the rest of them. Every time Thomas pushed, the thing twisted, bending wrong, like a puppet with broken strings. "You don't belong here," Thomas snarled, his voice strained as he shoved against his own reflection. The other Thomas laughed, low, amused. "You brought me back with you," it whispered. Eleanor's breath hitched. It was true. When Thomas had returned, when the music had pulled him free, something else had come through with him. The world was never meant to take someone back without consequence. And now the consequence was here. The thing slammed Thomas against the wall so hard the plaster cracked. He gasped. The air knocked from his lungs. And then the thing turned toward David. Thomas froze. "No," he choked out. "No, you don't touch him." But the thing only smiled. "Would you like to take my place, David?" it whispered. David's small body trembled. He shook his head furiously, pressing himself against Eleanor. "No!" The thing took a slow step forward. "You already did it once," it murmured. "You played the song. You pulled your father back. Maybe now it's your turn to go." Eleanor's breath caught. No, she wouldn't let this happen. She moved without thinking. "Get away from him." The thing tilted its head, its smile unfaltering. "You can't stop it," it murmured. "The balance must be restored." Eleanor's mind snapped. She didn't know what force was driving her, what primal, desperate part of her soul had taken control, but she grabbed the violin. The one Thomas had left behind, the one that still held his name carved into the wood. She lifted it, and she played. The moment the bow touched the strings, the air ripped apart. A sound exploded through the room. Not just music, not just notes, but something more. A force, a weight, a command. The thing let out a shriek, staggering back, its form glitching, flickering, distorting. Eleanor played faster, stronger. The walls of the house shuddered. The violin screamed, the music twisting and turning, pulling at something unseen. The thing clutched at its head, its body convulsing. Thomas moved. He surged forward, grabbing onto the thing's arm, his grip iron tight. "Where do you belong?" Thomas growled. The thing gasped, its eyes darting to the mirror, or what was left of it. The shattered shards. the broken doorway. Thomas understood. And then, with everything he had left, he threw the thing toward the mirror. The violin's final note pierced the air. And then, the thing was gone. The house went silent. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, her breath ragged, her entire body shaking. Thomas stood frozen, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. David sobbed. "Is it gone?" Silence. And then, the violin broke. The strings snapped. The wood cracked down the middle. And in the air, the whisper of a voice. "Thank you." Thomas's entire body sagged. It was over. The days that followed were quiet. The mirror was gone. The violin was buried beneath the old conservatory, along with the remnants of a song that should have never been played. And Thomas was himself again. David no longer woke up crying. Eleanor no longer felt the air shift with something unseen. The house was just a house. But sometimes, when the nights were quiet, when the world settled into stillness, Thomas swore he could hear something. Not a whisper, not a presence, just the faintest trace of a violin. Soft, distant, like the sound of a door that had finally closed. And stayed closed.